Welcome to Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. Ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last, but certainly not least, all of you that desperately cling to your confirmation bias. Whether your interest is Atlantis, Zeus, or anything in between, we tackle it all from our quantumly entangled castle tucked away in the ancient flood-battered Central Pangaean mountain range. We're a podcast dedicated to exploring the ancient, mysterious, and unknown with logic and reason, and where we also theorize the fourth dimension exists as the spiritual. Only trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation, so if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, turn off the podcast now. That being said, I am once again joined by Reverend Harrison Smith. It's been a good 6 months or so, give or take, since we've done our Bible is Viable series, but he has finally decided he wants to return and put up with me once again. So how you doing, Father?
It's not that I finally decided I want to deal with you again. It's just, it's been a lot moving, I think, twice since we last talked.
No, I understand. I got to bust your chops a little bit, though, so.
No, I am excited to be back, and I am eager to be back with you today and to share a little bit more.
Yeah, so for those of our listeners that are just tuning in to this episode and aren't familiar with the other series that he's been doing, the last one was episode 15 back, released on August 14th of 2024. So if you want a little bit of context as to what we're going to be talking about here, you can go back and listen to that. If not, feel free to just brave it without the background information. So that being said, I guess I'll kick it off because I was listening back to the episode that we did back in August. And you had a point that you brought up that because when the Israelites followed the laws and everything in the Bible, things went well for them. And when they didn't, things went bad. Like they got invaded and they had to fight all these wars and they lost. So I wanted to pose a question here because I kind of have to play more of the atheist and the skeptic for the Socratic method from this perspective. How do we not just like chalk that up to pure coincidence? Or to, you know, like maybe even putting like good vibes out into the universe. Like when you do good things kind of come back. And when you do bad things come back.
That is a fair question, and one that I honestly probably should have thought of when I was originally presented to you last. But I will say this. If you read the history of the nations around them and you read as we're going into First Kings, when we were reading there, you'll see there's a chain of events that lead into that. There's like many decades of kind of malfeasance on the Israel's behalf before God says, you know what, fine. And it's taken those decades where God has raised up those foreign nations and strengthened them and put them in a position to deliver God's wrath upon his own people. And so it's really interesting, and it's a lot larger of a deep dive than most people want to go through, and it's honestly a really intense historical study.
Right. No, that's fair. I just wanted to point out that, hey, sometimes you do see like people have like ill intentions and it'll behave poorly, like in like the business world or something, where they'll cheat people and they'll do all these bad things and backstab, and they will kind of succeed and get ahead for a little while before the consequences of their actions will catch up with them as well. So I just wanted to contrast that, because I know that wasn't your main point and you weren't building a whole argument off of that. But as I was re-listening to it and thinking about it as like, I've got to play the Socratic method here. I've got to be the devil's advocate, if you will, for the other side against all of this. So that was just kind of one thing that stood out in my mind I wanted to address. So I'll kick it over to you for any final thoughts on that, and then you can take us on to the next segment here.
Yeah, just one small thought on that is like Christ, when he was on earth, he delivered a speech saying, even what good is it for you to do good to those who love you? For even, the heathens that love, do good to those who love them. How much more are you to do the same to those who love you, right? It makes no sense. He's saying that's why I've called you to love those who hate you and persecute you and revile you, right? So that's kind of like the thing. Yes, it's natural for those who do good to have good done unto them. It's also natural for people who do bad to have bad done unto them. That God has called us to break that and say, even if they do bad to me, I will do good unto them, right?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think from what you said, we're going to start transitioning now into talking about more of the validity of Genesis, which we went through at the very beginning of this podcast. Is that where we're heading now?
Yes, sir. Today we are going to get into some nitty gritty, talk about some history, some biblical history, and then we're going to talk about the book of Genesis itself, and then we'll get into we're going to get into all that. So let's start here with some brief biblical history. So everyone likes to get out their Bible and turn to their favorite chapter and verse, right? Everyone likes to be able to use chapters and verses to kind of pin things out and be like, yeah, let me pull that specific verse and misquote it, right? It's easy to do, and a lot of people like to do it. But we have to talk about how the Bible wasn't designed or written that way. In fact, most of the chapters and verses aren't integral to the text at all. They actually start appearing in manuscripts from the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation most commonly used by the Catholic Church and has also been used by many other churches. But the 13th century is when you start seeing these chapters and verses come in. And they kind of subdivide the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, often called the Old Testament and New Testament, or for those of us who just call it the Bible completely. These little divisions and chapters were put in there to kind of help make it easier to navigate, especially for copyists and scribes, so that way they would make sure they didn't lose their spot on where things were going.
I can affirm
All right.
to the need for that as I've been studying a lot of Mesopotamian mythology over the last couple months. It does get a little bit hard to work through some of the translations and cross-reference across like other versions and identify stuff when there's not clear denoted verses added in after the fact to specify that, hey, this is addressing, this specific section or region or, however you want to quantify it. So I can definitely understand and get behind that.
Yeah. And so you also have to remember most of the New Testament especially was just letters. No one puts a chapter in their letter.
Right.
I'm kind of old school and I still write letters to people, but I don't put chapters in my letters. And so most of these scrolls were intended to be read straight through. No stopping. One contiguous story. Enjoy it, right? And so, especially in the Hebrew community today, the chapters and divisions are still largely ignored, which is kind of a breath of fresh air when you consider like how these were designed for us to be consumed.
Right.
But since they're there, we're going to use them because it helps us understand where stories are in the Bible. But also, I need to put that warning out there about the chapters and verses not being properly out there aligned, because it can be misleading and you're going to start combining sections that maybe weren't one contiguous story or are a few stories put together, right? Like the Sermon on the Mount is just a giant chapter in Luke, but it's a long way to read through. I'm sorry, Matthew. And it gets divided into shorter sermons in other Gospels, right? So you kind of have to just take it with a grain of salt and realize that you have to read the context with it and to see where it came from. And we're going to do the same thing with Genesis here in a little bit.
All right, sounds good. Well, let's dive into it.
Okay, so we are going to kind of focus here today on Genesis chapters 1 through 3, right? Given that reference point. To kind of serve as our crux to make the argument for the entire book, right? Talking about its validity and why we can trust it, where it comes from, so on and so forth. But first, let's talk about some theories that I don't inherently believe that are accurate, but they're still out there. So a lot of people, more traditionalists, would argue that Moses, the biblical figure Moses, from the time where they left Egypt in the Exodus all the way through the wilderness, and they would argue Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Pentateuch. Now, the reason I don't typically ascribe to this is because Moses dies in the first 5 books of the Bible.
Plot hole.
So it'd be kind of hard. It'd be kind of, I don't know, in my opinion, for a root of God, and again, my opinion, to have Moses write, and then Moses died and Joshua rose up.
Yeah, that doesn't quite add up. I can agree to that. I mean, maybe it was just that his work was finished by someone else. I'd propose that one as a counterpoint, but I can get behind your reasoning and logic here overall.
Right, and that is a very common thing. They're like, oh well, Joshua or one of the other Levites or scribes came up and just finished his work. Okay, cool. But then you also have to look at times where, it said that when Joshua went up and wrote the entire book of the law up there, and he said, as for me and my house, I will serve the Lord, but you make your decision before we go on. Does that make sense to have the 5 books of the Bible written by Joshua at that time? We're just taking his time writing that in stone in front of the entire Hebrew nation.
Yeah, that doesn't quite add up either. So no, I'd agree with that. So what's your solution for us?
So we'll get to my solution in a little bit.
Oh, you're gonna leave us in suspense. All right.
It's not that. I'm trying to give credence to other arguments before we talk into my argument. Other people have ascribed, is just the chain of the Levites, right? The priestly tribe of the Hebrews that had to do it, right? So God when he set them aside to be his priests into the nation of Israel, he just took them as they were doing their work, and he gave them the divine word, right? Going into that inspiration notation method that we talked about a few sessions ago, right?
Right.
I think that's part of the story. Honestly, I do. I won't lie. I do believe that's part of it, and we'll get into that. However, we're going to see some things in here that wouldn't make sense for a Levite to write, and we'll get into that in just a bit. The other people are the opposing force would be the people that believe the Aaronites wrote it. So those who came involved after Aaron, who helped Moses, but also kind of compete to say that Aaron should have been the leader of the people of Hebrews. Stories in the Old Testament that point to this is like these stories of where it talks and emphasizes that Moses' wife wasn't a Hebrew, right? And they try to say that's why Moses wasn't allowed to go into the Promised Land, because he was an ungodly heathen, right?
Interesting. Okay.
So things like that. And then you'll have the kind of theory that I ascribe to, which is going to be the 4 author. It's not really 4 authors, but 4 author group belief. All right, and we are going to get into this as we do a little bit of a reading, and so you can see where I would get this from. Okay, but the 4 sources, we use letters. We're not very original. So we have the first source, J. So this is going to be for a group of scribes that use the word Yahweh, which is transcribed as Jehovah, right? Then you're going to have E, which is the Elohist, those who refer to God as Elohim. And then you're going to have P, which refers to a priestly source that also uses Elohim and other divine names, but just not Yahweh. And then we're going to have D, which we'll get into just a little bit later, which kind of just believe they wrote Deuteronomy, so they're not entirely relevant for today's conversation.
Okay. So basically, different scribes using different names of God is kind of the indicating factor here that you're leaning into.
Yes.
Okay.
Not only different names for God, but different perspectives on stories.
Okay.
So, pardon me, I have to
No,
go back in my notes to a different spot.
You're good. No worries. I'm giving you your time to get sorted.
All right. So, Genesis 1 through 3. This is the infamous creation story, right? We've talked about it a few times, but now we want to really get analytical with it. So, most people who read Genesis 1 through 3 will notice something almost right off the bat. You get almost kind of double a story of everything, right? You have creation recounted, you have the creation of humankind, right? So humankind is narrated first in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, and then again in Genesis chapter 2, verses 7 through 23.
Right.
And generally, these, if you're sitting there, you're reading it, you're like, I thought I just read how man was made. That's odd. And then you're like, wait, what came first, the animals or man? Or was it man then animals? It's interesting, right?
Yeah.
This is typically where people will be like, oh, well, obviously they don't know, or they're just trying to cover their tracks in case they got something wrong. That's not inherently right. So these episodes, they can't be just seen as a general description of creation, right? In chapter 1, and then it's elaborated upon in chapter 2, because the story of humankind being created is a lot longer in chapter 2, right? But it's not an elaboration. These two accounts, they differ too much in their detail, right? You can't just say that. It would, right? You can't elaborate and then contradict. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Where do they contradict that?
All right, we're about to get into that.
Oh, heck yeah.
They aren't inherently, or aren't. Contradict is what it seems on the surface. We're going to get into how it all melds together. But let's just say you're a skeptic and you think that they contradict. So in chapter 1, verses 24 through 25, you can read, on day 6, the first land and animals were created, and then man and woman were created simultaneously, right? In 26 and verses 26 and 28. Wherever in chapter 2, first man is created in verse 7, and then the animals are created in verses 18 through 20. And only after these are found unsuitable to be man's partner, chapter 2, verse 20 says, is woman created in verses 21 through 23. If this was a single story by a single author, it would be so self-contradictory that you would laugh at them. So maybe you have two different authors trying to tell the same story. You just might.
So I think
this might be.
I think I've dived into this a little bit before, where it comes down to more of the semantics of the original Hebrew itself on how you read those later verses of chapter 2, as to whether it's an actual blatant contradiction or not. Because tense gets a little bit confusing in some of the original Hebrew as to whether you read it, now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky in Genesis 2:19, in terms of like referring to that he had already done it as per the previous creation account, or whether they're saying it's an actual contradiction. Like, it gets a little bit hazy within the tenses of the Hebrew, if my memory serves me right. But I don't know, maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit. You might be about to mention something on that.
So we're actually going to go back to another word study. All right, so in Genesis 1, God is called Elohim, right? The Lord God, right? That E source that we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
Right? So in verse chapter 1, 27, man is created by Elohim. And then chapter 2, 4, 7, human is formed, right? Two different kind of oh my god, the words are escaping my mouth. Two different ways of saying created, right? If I created something, that implies from out of nothing. Formed implies I took something else to create, which God created the initial substance anyway, so it's still a valid way to say that God created. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
All right. In fact, the word created is used a total of 7 times in chapter 1 and verse 1 all the way up to chapter 2 verse 3. But in chapter 2 verse 4 through chapter 3 verse 24, created is not used at all. All right, so the division here isn't inherently at the chapter mark, it's a little bit after.
Yeah, I remember
Right.
noticing this as well in my studies, is that like it seems like chapter 2 was almost put at the wrong spot.
Just a little bit. Right, so notice here the style of chapter 1. It's completely different than how the latter half of chapter 2 and 3 go. Genesis 1, as most people know, it's ordered by the days, right? And on the first day, God created this and that, or correction, he created this, and that was the first day, right? Or the second day, or whatever day it was.
Yeah, very
Where if you look
systematic
at
narrative.
Yeah. Chapters 2 and 3 are much looser. They're flowing. It's almost formulaic, almost poematic, right? Which I believe we talked about before.
Yeah, it toes the line of poetry, but it's not quite poetry in of itself. It still does read like a narrative, almost like the meaning of the narrative was so important they wanted to make it vaguely like poetry, but still have the narrative grammatical phrases in it that you would find.
Yeah. But now, most importantly here, let's look at how they kind of portray God. Right? So in chapter 1 up to chapter 2, verse 3, God is powerful. He's majestic, right? He's unquestionable, right? He's a fixed figure, right? He creates, he makes, he does this, and that was good. And then chapters 2 and 3, God moves, right? You'll see examples where God moves about in the garden. He talks with Adam and Eve, and he clothes them, right? He does things, he interacts, he moves, right? So they focus on 2 different natures of God.
Okay, yeah. I can get behind that.
I'm glad you can get behind that.
So almost like it's more 2 distinct entities in a sense, but not like talking in terms of polytheism, just more 2 distinct expressions, maybe is a better word.
Right. So they're focusing on different aspects of the same person, right? So, for instance, right, you've met me as a friend, right? We worked through a school together, and we went through this. And how would you describe me?
Very personable, knowledgeable, caring individual.
Right. And then people that were in this last little combatives class that I taught, they would probably say I was more strict, that I was hard on them, and that I didn't care as much, right? Because you see 2 different parts of me based upon how the relationship is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's almost like context matters.
Yeah. Almost like context matters.
No, I would agree with
yeah.
that. You present yourself in different ways depending on the situations that you're found in. I mean, there's a huge difference in how anyone's going to present themselves in a more formal, like a formal dress, like suit party, or like, kind of like a business meeting or a wedding, versus like how they would present themselves at home or amongst friends, or drinking a beer at the end of the day or whatever. There's going to be a stark difference amongst the 2.
All right. So let's take that into the biblical context. So I'm espousing that there's 2 different groups of writers, right? So if one of them are, by God's law, are supposed to talk about God, do you think they're going to use more formal terms where they talk about how God is powerful and majestic? Or do you think they're going to talk about him as more of a relation that moves?
You're talking in the first part, Genesis 1?
Yeah. Just in general, If you think God ordained, say, the Levites, to be his priests unto the nation, do you think they're going to be more formal with how they talk, or do you think they're going to be more relational?
Oh, they're definitely going to be more formal.
Right. And then if you say you're the jealous child that is trying to vie for the position of influence on religious affairs, would you say you would use more relational talk or more formal?
I'd say more relational.
Right, because you want to convey that God moves and he uses all, right? He's more relatable. He talks to us. He clothes us. And then the other people would want to focus on, well, God said we're supposed to do this, so we're going to do this. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with this.
Right. So, where does this story from Genesis 1 end? Mostly we want to say that it ends in the first half of chapter 2, verse 4, right? To kind of frame the story. The word pair, heaven and earth, as well as the verb create, appear together in this context only, right? In chapters 1, verse 1, all the way through chapter 2, verse 4a, right? And so this is what we're going to call our first story, right? Where it ends, such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created, right? So that would conclude the story. Doesn't that just sound like a strong close to a story rather than the beginning of a second story?
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. It does seem like the labelings of the titles and the chapters and the verses is really off here. I've noticed that as well.
Okay. So now we're going to completely jump ship, right? We're going to jump to Genesis chapter 11. You'll be like, why?
Oh, boy.
It's okay. Yeah, I know. Because I need to provide reference and context to how you can see where other stories face a similar context. Right? So, the framing of a story, right? We talked about how they use the same sort of language. Let's jump to Genesis chapter 11, the story of the Tower of Babel. Right? There are several words that indicate the limits, right? This is to be inclusive of the same story. In Genesis chapter 11, it begins with the phrase, the whole earth was, and then concludes with, over the face of the whole earth, right? You see how that's the same sort of language where in Genesis chapter 1 it says, and heaven and earth were created, and this is how the story of heaven and earth were created.
Is this
to see how it?
Is this Genesis 11:1 that you're reading from and you're comparing this to, or is this a different verse in chapter 11?
So it should be verse 1 and then verse 9.
Okay. I'm just trying to follow along here a little bit. No, you're good. I want our listeners to be able to follow along too if they're trying to figure out exactly what we're talking about here without having to just listen.
No, you're good. It's just, like we were talking about right before we got on here, I just had surgery on my eyes, so I can't see the best right now.
Excuses. No, I'm just kidding, man.
But does that? But do you see that how that framing is put in there, both in Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 2:4, and then as well as Genesis 11:1 and then Genesis 11:9?
Yeah, I think I can see what you're saying there. That there's like kind of like a finality and sectioned way of doing it where there's similar phraseology used across both.
Right. Now we're going to jump one more time to a source outside of Genesis, but still in the Bible, so you can see, it's not just here that this author appears. Let's jump to Psalm chapter 8, and we're going to look at verses 2 and verse 10. And you should see this phrase, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth, right? Framing what their purpose is and what they're talking about.
Right.
And you'll see this is something that's so common that, at least I was taught this in most of my English and writing courses and composition courses in college, where they say you should have a thesis statement at the beginning that tells them this is what I'm going to say and why. And then at the end, you have a conclusion statement that says, this is what I said, and this is why I said it.
Yep, that's what I was taught as well, is that your introduction is kind of like a broad funnel to narrow of your subject, and then your conclusion is a narrow to broad funnel once again.
Right. So you can see that these authors, the biblical authors, do the same thing.
Oh, okay. I kind of see where you're going with this, where basically the phraseology gives us an indication of when there's a shift amongst sections and a conclusion of certain sections.
Right. In addition, there's a Hebrew word. I would butcher the pronunciation of it, but I'm going to go ahead and attempt it. Ele, I think I'm still butchering it, which means such is, or so is, depending on which translation you're reading, which is typically used to point either backward or to point forward. Right, so it's either introducing or concluding a statement or a story. In this case, with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to Genesis 2:4, where it concludes, so such is the story of heaven and earth, right? So Genesis chapter 2, verse 4a points backwards to the right.
Okay. I'm trying to keep up with
teaching.
all your bouncing around here. No, you're good though. This is good stuff.
Right. And then let's look into what would be our indication of the next story beginning, which would be Genesis chapter 2, 4b, the second part of chapter 2, verse 4, the latter half of that, moving into chapter 3. Which is going to be the absence of the to create verb, and the presence of other sort of relational terms and such. I am like, can we take a break real quick?
Yeah, we can absolutely take a break. Let you collect your thoughts a little bit more here. We've been rolling for a bit anyway, so we'll be right back. Stay tuned. LA, we have returned to the beginning of a new segment here, according to the original Hebrew that Harrison is walking us through. So, Father, back over to you.
You really got to stop calling me Father.
You have children, do you not?
I do have children. All right. So let's look at a small thing here in the Hebrew. Or really, you can read it in English, and it's evident what's said in Hebrew. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. So these are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, and in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. So in the first half of the verse, if you're reading this in the King James, New King James, ESV, NIV, there's a comma that kind of separates these two clauses. So that first half before the commas talks about the story or the generations of the heavens and of the earth. And then after the comma, it says, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Anyone that is quite familiar with Hebrew terms and how they talk will always tell you that the most important thing to the speaker or the author is what's listed first. Right?
Right.
So you'll notice in one phrase it goes from heaven and earth, and then in the same verse, quote unquote, it then switches into the earth and heaven, which would indicate that either the importance switched or the author switched.
Okay. Interesting.
Right? Very interesting. For another example of this, you can read it all through like Acts, that you'll start seeing a lot of the times when the apostles are introduced, you'll see who's introduced first, and then oftentimes you'll hear about the missionary journeys, and for instance, the setting apart of Barnabas and Paul, right? It's Barnabas and then Paul. And then about right before I think their third missionary journey, it then switches to say Paul and Barnabas instead of the other way around. Because when they first set out, Barnabas was more important. He was the one that brought people together. He was the one that made the connection that brought Paul into the fold.
Right.
And then later on, now we know Acts, the book of Acts was written by Luke, and that's all well and good, which isn't it where you can see where someone changes importance. But here in Genesis, God is still the important one. So it doesn't seem to make sense in a creation story to switch the importance of heaven and earth.
Yeah, this is interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm learning something new here. This is some good insight. I like it. Yeah, I'm tracking with what you're saying here. Linguistically, it makes more sense to stick with the same thematic, semantic word choice you just chose and the order you just chose, and the switching here indicates that there's likely some other author at play. Did I get that right, or?
Yes, you did. Sorry, I was trying not to burp into the mic.
Appreciate it.
All right. So, and then let's now start looking at the big semantic difference. Right? We talked about how they talk about God, the order of events. We talked about their slight word choice. And now that we've talked about that word choice, it kind of gives us an indication of the themes of these two creation stories, right? So creation story 1 is chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to chapter 2, verse 4a. And then story 2 is chapter 2, verse 4b, all the way up to chapter 3, verse 24. Okay? Thematically, we see that the first one, story 1, is a focus on the creation of the world in which people play a role, right, in what's created. And the second story, people are the focus in which the world is related to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I see what you're saying there.
Right. That is to say, this first story is the ancient Israelite story of creation of the world. Whereas the second story is a different Israelite author talking about the creation of humankind.
Right. It's a different intent of the narratives.
Exactly. Which, if you're telling the story of creation of the world, are you really going to focus on the downfall of man? Or are you going to focus on the order of creation?
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying there. You have there's a different reason that you're writing, according to like the theory you're proposing here. And so you have to keep the intent of writing in mind as you're exploring the, like what we actually see in the texts.
All right. So then we have to ask ourselves here this one question. All right. So far we've just kind of noticed it's a different author. Maybe. Or maybe the author switched intents. Maybe. So why can't we read the second story as an elaboration of the first? All right. So why can't chapters 1 through 3 just be one really long story? It's just compositionally, it wouldn't make sense, would it? The vocabulary changes, the literary style changes, and then the focus and content of each story is different. I've also heard it proposed that what if Genesis 2:4 be through Genesis 3 through 24 is just a relation of the creation of the Garden of Eden. Okay, so let's sit with that for just a little bit, because this is a theory that I believe holds some validity, but doesn't quite capture the whole grasp. So wise men, I've heard talk about this, and I would not discredit their wisdom and intellect because they've been in this game a lot longer than I have. So I'm going to give credit where credit's due. So going through the chapter 2:4b and through Genesis chapter 3:24, we have references to the Garden of Eden, right? But did they come at the beginning of chapter 2? Or did they come closer to when we start talking about the fall of man? Well,
Yeah, it's not until
let's
man
look.
is created and then man is put in the garden.
Yes. Right? So 2 verse 7 says, And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And then verse 8, and the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and then he put man whom he had formed. Right?
Okay.
And so like it makes sense here that you could put the context of, it makes sense to say that the animals were still created before man, but then from 2:8 into about 2:17, I'm sorry, up until actually 2:24, 2:24 or 25, whichever you prefer to end there, that's the story of the creation of Eden, right? That makes sense to say that in Genesis chapter 1, animals, yes, are created before man. And then, if you take a micro picture of just after that, when mankind was created, he also made the Garden of Eden because he had already made everything on the earth. Now he's just decorating his garden. Right? It makes sense. And I think that's perfectly valid. And as you can see, that both authors are still correct in how they're explaining the story. It's just the second author doesn't care about the creation of the rest of the world. He cares about the story of the relation between God and man.
Okay.
Do you see where I'm going with this?
I think so. It's more of a thematic shift. That's kind of what you're saying, or am I misreading it here?
No, you're perfectly right. So what I'm saying overall is Genesis 2:4b to Genesis 3:24 is not simply an elaboration, and it's not a direct continuation either. We already hit the big thematic difference here. But I'm also saying that some people will suggest that Genesis 2:4 onto Genesis 3:24 is simply a story of the creation of Eden, when it's not.
Yeah, that doesn't
Right?
quite fit. I mean, it's mentioned, it's a theme, but it's not like the central theme.
Exactly. But also, this refutes the claim that, oh, well, there's two orders in creation. There's not. In Genesis 1, we have the clear explanation of order of creation of the earth and the heavens and the water and of animals and all that, with man being last as the kind of the centerpiece of creation, if you were. And then Genesis chapter 2 takes focus on that centerpiece, right? That's what they're focused on. God made man. How did he make man? He drew him up from the dust of the ground and breathed air into his nostrils and gave man life. And they became a living soul. And then he created a garden for them. And he walked with them in that garden, right? There's that relation of God directly with man. That is that author's focus. So
Right.
why else would you include such an intimate detail?
I mean, this is kind of the whole crux of the Bible, is it not? Is it's trying to encapsulate what initially was and what the whole Bible is about, is it's trying to work our way back to that and then realizing we can't actually work our way back to that and that there has to be a sacrifice that then comes. And then that leads us up to the thematic resolution of Revelation, where once again, heaven then comes down to earth, where God creates a new earth and then once again, lives with man and abides with man and has a relationship with man. And so this is the key theme of what's missing in our hearts from a Christian perspective that the author is trying to kind of lay the framework for. So in my mind, I agree with you. It doesn't make sense for it to be, the focus is on Eden. No, the focus is on the perfection and the relational aspect of God.
Right. I mean, you want to start preaching, or
Sorry, yeah, that was a little bit preachy there, a little bit more than I tend to dive into on the podcast. But we are talking about the Christian perspective, so we've got to break down the Christian mythology account in its fullest. So,
Yes. No, so it absolutely sets up a theme that will definitely be recurring throughout the entire biblical narrative. It's just, getting back in there and seeing the two different authors there.
So would you say it's actually two different authors then, or could it just be the thematic shift of, okay, here's the groundwork of everything being created and God is being addressed in that context as a very formal creator, and then we shift themes in Genesis 2:4b here as you're outlining for us, and that the same author then takes these ideas of man being created and embodying after the initial creation the whole perfection that once was, and then flows it into what happens from there. Like, how to put that into simpler terms, how do we know that it's not just a thematic shift amongst the same author versus two distinct authors?
Because literally because of how they refer to God and how they relate to God.
Okay.
Jews and Hebrews are very, very legalistic when it comes to how they could write or even say God, right? Even in modern context, I know many Hebrews who have so much regard for the name of God that when they write G-O-D, they don't write G-O-D, they write G_D.
Yeah.
Because they cannot write the name of him.
Yeah.
Right? Especially if it's meant to be a temporary thing.
And you see that with Yahweh as well, where they wouldn't actually write the full name of Yahweh. They would leave certain characters out to where I think it's speculated by some, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we don't actually know if the Yahweh is a true pronunciation because they wouldn't say it. Maybe I'm mixing some of my facts up or something there, but that was my understanding of Jewish culture.
I know they do leave, they pretty much leave vowels out of all of their writing. But I don't know enough to say whether or not we know about Yahweh as the correct pronunciation. We do know of Jehovah, right? That they would say Jehovah, which leads us to believe that they would use Yah and Weh, those two different words there, or not words, syllables. Ooh, get myself in trouble real quick.
Yeah,
yes.
I might be mistaken. So one of the listeners can fact check me on that. That was just something I had heard in passing some years ago, so I'm not sure of the validity of it or not. But yes, you are correct. The vowels are pretty much non-existent in the Hebrew language. They use the nikud, which is like these dots and lines that you'll see like over certain characters to annotate what vowels come after certain characters. But that's like an informal version of Hebrew writing. The more formal version is primarily just like vowels. So, but right. Yeah. Anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole with that one.
I know. Going back to the original question, how do I know it's two different authors here? Again, so in Genesis 1 through Genesis 2 through 4, here you have the different uses of God, whether it's referring to Elohim or Jehovah, right? And that's a very, very important thing, right? Because of how they would ascribe it. And this even comes down to later in history, you'll have different lines in Judean history where you have northern Israel and southern Israel, right? Where the kingdom splits. And the northern kingdom would become much more, oh my goodness, the words. They become much more likely to use the word Elohim as opposed to Jehovah, right? Because this word it refers to God, right? It says God, where Jehovah is the Lord or the Eternal, which is Yahweh.
Yeah, okay. I think I see where you're going with this because when the two kingdoms,
the very name that they use for God indicates who they are.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with this. The kingdom split. I do remember this because one of the kingdoms that the kingdom that didn't have Jerusalem, they set up their own place of worship, right? And then that would make sense that they would want to refer to God as being more personable, so that they could kind of be like, hey, we have a right to be able to worship him here because he's a personal God, and we can worship him where we please. Versus the other mentality of being more strict of, no, this is where God said we have to worship him, so we have to worship here. Am I getting that right?
Yes, yes. You're starting to understand where this argument of multiple authors comes from,
Yeah. So basically what you're kind of
which
proposing
leads
here,
into
sorry, I think we got some lag going on here. So basically what you're proposing here is that we're taking two different accounts of the creation from Genesis from two different cultures of Israel, from that split, and that the Genesis 1 to 2 4a is assigned to, the more strict culture, and then 2 4b on to the end of chapter 3 is from this culture that's split off of the main kingdom of Israel. Is that kind of where we're going with this?
I'll get into who's who in a little bit, but first we're going to need to take a small break.
Yeah, sure. We will be right back. And we have returned to bring you more insights about Genesis months after we've initially dissected Genesis. I'm still learning stuff here, so thanks for bringing all of this stuff to our attention here, Harrison. This is some good wisdom. What else you got for us?
Well, first I gotta give credit where credit is due. I'm just a poor humble guy that is bringing other people's work and presenting it to you, which I believe I sent you those so
Yes.
You can cite them.
Yes, they will be in the show notes,
right.
The sources that Harrison is using here, so you can go fact check us for yourselves.
Yes, and then you can go fact check their sources.
Yes, a lot of fact checking going on.
Okay. All right. So let's move back into our source criticism and talking about where all this comes from, because we've been getting deep into that. There's either one author who can't make up his mind on what he focuses on, or we have multiple authors focusing on one thing each. So the stories in Genesis 1 through 2 4a, and then 2 4b through 324 can't be viewed as fragments, right? To say one of them is a fragment would be to kind of rob it of its, entirety. To say that it's incomplete without the other one would be kind of a lie. You can honestly read chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to chapter 2, 4a as a complete story, right? It would seem a nice story of how God created everything. Likewise, you could do the same with 2, 4b all the way up to 324. So it doesn't have quite a nice an ending with, the fall of mankind and all that. So let's talk about it. We can see each of them as more rather introductions to much more extensive documents, or into more extensive sources. That they may be found in the Torah, and this is how we're going to start going through our source criticism of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, right?
Okay.
Specifically, right? We looked at that story, those two stories, as a way to bring up this argument. When you apply it to the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books as a whole, it suggests that you can see at least 4 main sources, or at least 4 originally separate sources that have been put together, right? And so each of these sources are called J, E, D, and P. And like many other things, this is still a scholarly debate. This just happens to be the theory that I can get behind, and I believe is more factually correct, as the evidence points to it, especially with how deep we've just dived into just these first 3 chapters of the Bible. The oldest document is more than likely the J sources. These are the ones that refer to God with a 4-letter name Yahweh, which is often transcribed in modern English as Jehovah. The JPS translation represents this name as the Lord, while other translators use the Eternal or Yahweh or the YHWH. Eyes are really bad right now. This is probably a Judean author. This source was written in the first half of the monarchic period, otherwise under the kingship period of the Hebrews. All right. Any questions on that, or anything you want to talk about before I move on, just so we can break it up a little easier for our audience?
No, yeah, you're good. I see where you're coming from there. I don't know if I could 100% definitively say it's from two different authors, but I can definitely see where you're coming from and arguing that point. And I do think that there is some validity and historical credence to suggest that idea. So I'm not going to really disagree with that, but then maybe this is where you're going. But then the question becomes, how do we know, especially if this is coming from multiple different sources, how do we know that this is actually, accurate and reliable, especially if this was happening at such a much later time from Genesis as the split of kingdoms of Israel and Judea, as we see outlined in 1 Kings?
Alrighty then. So we'll get into that much later. I'm going to finish up this summarization of the 4-source theory. So the next source that we have is going to be the E source, or the Elohist documents. These are the ones that refer to God in Genesis using the term Elohim, that is God, in the original Hebrew. And it may originate from the northern kingdom and slightly later than when J was written. Because, right, we believe J was written with the rise of the monarchic period, right? So you have Saul, David, and Solomon, and all those. And then you have the splitting of the kingdom into the northern and southern kingdom. So obviously there'd have to be a split for there to be a northern kingdom to refer to. E is relatively short. It's not nearly as extensive, and unlike the J and the P source, it is unclear if it was originally viewed as a separate document. In other words, it might have been already written into as an addition to either J or P. Does that make sense so far?
I think you lost me a little bit on that. So basically you're saying by the time of the kingdom split that it's possible that they were just one combined source? Or am I getting lost in the sauce here?
Slightly lost. It is possible that E was written into either J or P, but while the kingdoms were split, right? So,
okay.
For instance, the Northern Kingdom priests wrote E to justify their position.
Okay.
Does it make sense?
And then the lower kingdom of Judea, or Jerusalem, is they integrated that into their version later on. Yes,
more than likely when the return from the exile period was completed.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, kind of like okay, we just went through this huge trauma together of being taken captive and moved to another nation, and now we're back and we've got to rebuild society. So let's combine everything that we have together to rebuild society, like as it once was before, but better in a sense, because we're pulling from everybody's information and resources.
Right, which moves us into the P source. The P source is what we are typically referred to as the priestly source, which is where we get the letter P from. Otherwise, it just makes no sense. So the priestly source often uses Elohim, but they also use other divine names, just not Yahweh. Right? They refuse to use it, right? Because that's they're priestly, they're more legal, and most of their documents are shaped and formed by priestly concerns, like purity and order and the divine presence amongst Israel itself.
Okay.
So does that make sense so far?
Yeah, it makes sense.
And then kind of the last source that we have is the Delta source, or D source. And it stands for Deuteronomy, the final book of the Torah, right? With the exception of its final chapters, which contain a diversity of material, most of Deuteronomy just kind of focuses. They have a very special vocabulary, a lot of theological concerns, especially about where you ought to worship God, right? In Jerusalem, in the Holy Temple, right? So likely, the priestly source and the Deuteronomical source are not unified, right? They come from two different traditions. Does that make sense?
I think so. So we're pulling a number of different sources then for Genesis.
Yes, we are. Just not D, because D is Deuteronomy.
Right. Okay. So J, E, and P, and then D is for Deuteronomy, and so that feeds into the larger Pentateuch.
Yes. All right. So let's start putting things together. All that confusing stuff said, let's try and make it all work together. Okay. So given the apparent existence of all these sources, somehow they had to have been put together or redacted, if you would. And this is why some scholars will suggest a final editor, otherwise known as our redactor, because for some reason people prefer redacting instead of editing. They're not modern editors, but redactor, because we have to be fancy. It's academic. I'm sorry, I make fun of academia all the time, even though I'm an academic myself.
Nope, no worries. You got to poke fun at everybody here. That's a kind of a normal thing that we do on the show. So,
all right. So it is believed the redactor probably was amongst the priestly source, because, well, we believe the priestly source is Genesis 1:1 through 2:4. So obviously they would want to put their story first. Kind of would make sense, right? If I'm the last guy to get to say so, my say so is going to be first.
Yeah, that's fair. No, I get that. And then that also fits because it's a bit more academic when you read Genesis chapter 1 and then the beginnings of chapter 2 there.
Yep. And then Genesis chapter 2:4 through the following, we believe comes from the J source, right? So exactly why were the sources put together? We don't know. Maybe. So it brings up two questions, though. Why were all the sources retained? And why were they combined the way they were? Right, which I think is kind of the crux of the question here of how can we determine, is this reliable? And then you have another question. Even if we answered if Genesis was reliable, why was the entire Bible put together the way it was? Which I believe points to the big question: is the Bible reliable?
Yeah.
Right. It's all connected in there.
You were one letter off from saying the episode title is the Bible viable. Man, instead you went with the Bible is reliable. Darn. Oh well. Next time.
Maybe.
No, so these are some great questions here, and this actually, because of the stuff we've been talking about on the podcast, I can shed a little bit of added insight into everything we're talking about here. So with Mesopotamian mythology, you would have a number of different names, quote unquote, names used for the same figure to annotate different traits of said figure. So in a previous episode, we talked about different flood myths in the Mesopotamian region. And for their Noah figure, you see a collection of different names. You see Utnapishtim used, you see Adrahasis used, and you see Ziazudra used. All three of these names refer to the same figure, talking about a Noah figure that existed and that survived a global flood. But each name is given to focus on different traits that fit the theme of the story being told specific to that region. So Utnapishtim means he who has life, or he who has like eternal life. And that's the theme from the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the story comes from, is where Gilgamesh is seeking out that life. And then Atrahasis means the exceedingly wise, and that fits because he is relying on the Mesopotamian god of wisdom, Ea or Enki, to give him the wisdom he needs to be able to help humanity survive. And then you have Ziazudra from the Eridu Genesis that talks about he who lay down his life in righteousness, or he who lived in Ancient of Days, which we have yet to dissect that story. But you see this trend in the Fertile Crescent area, and I'm starting to see this as you're talking about this here, where there's different names of God being used. It's talking about the same God, but it's just focusing on different aspects of that deity. And you see this in Mesopotamian mythology, where different names for the same Noah figure are used to communicate different aspects of the story. And so what we have here is a conglomeration of all of that, where we're putting all of this together and making it flow. But yes, all of that to say, I see how this fits with the context of the ancient Near East and their style and their approach of writing. But then the question does indeed then become, why was it all compiled together into one source?
And boy, do I have an answer for you.
Oh, heck yeah. VeggieTale style.
Yes. Okay. So there's no direct evidence, right? Which is why we're going to have to go to the plausible rather than definitive answers. Simply because when you're talking about a nation such as this and such as the Mesopotamians, as you've been researching, and all those many warring nations around there, the amount of times that they get killed off and then brought back and killed off and brought back is mind-numbing. And so you have to pick up pieces from what you can see in their history and from what actually came out and what survived. First off, we know the Bible exists. We know that the Pentateuch exists, right? We could see it. We could see many old copies of the Pentateuch, even the Dead Sea Scrolls and older copies that have been made, right? We can see that it's been around for a long time. So when do most of these start showing up? That's a great question. So we can see that most of these early documents had a certain prestige and authority in ancient Israel, which would make them, one, valuable to Israelites, and so they wouldn't discard them, but also that made them valuable to people like the Persians and the Babylonians, who conquered Israel and took their relics. And they would hold on to their relics because, like many of the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians were very polytheistic, and they believed that the gods of a certain area was that god of that certain area. And so they respected that, so they would take it back to their vaults and study it. Which leads us to believe that it's more likely during the Babylonian exile. I think, Daniel and all those sort of people, that they started to put together all these different traditions. Because at that time, there was no Israel. There was no Judah. It was just land conquered and run over by both Babylon, Persia, and someone else at the moment. I can't remember off the top of my head.
I think Assyria as well, right?
Yeah, Assyria. Yeah. And so they have a time where you have Daniel, who gets appointed to a very high position, and he's well respected, and he has other well respected Hebrews that get into the king's court and the king's office with them, so they have access to these documents, right? So it wouldn't be too beyond them to be able to put this together, or at least organize the putting together of God's word, which, if you also read a lot of what Daniel does and a lot of what Daniel's stories include, you could see where it would be very plausible at that point in time for these sources to have come together under a new priestly line, because they get released to go back to Israel, to go recreate Israel, right? Leading up to the time of silence in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it gives them plenty of time to put all this back together and to obey God faithfully, right? As we believe this comes from a priestly line, which means it's probably the survivors of the tribe of Levite, that came together and put this together, because they still held high regard for God and the preservation of his word. Not only that, from a Christian perspective and from a Hebrew perspective, we both believe that God will preserve his word eternally. Right?
Right.
So believing that and also seeing history and seeing what has happened, all these things have been preserved. And if you're going to say that through everything, that if, it's just happenstance that they get put together, and it's happenstance that they all survive, and it's just happenstance that there's more manuscripts and copies of these sources than any other book or story in history, then maybe you're not being logical or honest with yourself when you talk about textual criticism as to whether or not it's valid beyond anything else. Because even the writings for Gilgamesh and Homer's Iliad don't have as many manuscripts and are way more varied than these are.
Okay. I think I can kind of...
Just saying.
Yeah, I think I kind of see where you're going as a whole here. So we can reliably trust this as much, probably more so than we can other mythology accounts, at least back into the Babylonian period, just because of the consistency amongst the different accounts here, and that historically this is a high likelihood here. And that then we also know, my dad broke this one down in episodes 19 and 20, that there's a lot of theorizations out there. It's called higher criticism, that the Jewish people copied Babylonian mythology and made it their own. And I'm not sure if you have any notes on that or not, so feel free to chime in, if you do. But my dad broke that one down and showed how that was completely disproved by a finding, an archaeological dig where they recovered someone that was dated to being before the Babylonian period, but he actually had I think it was like a little scroll or like an amulet that had some writing from Deuteronomy on it. So we have evidence of these texts, even if they were fragmented initially and spread out amongst the different kingdoms of Israel, existing pre-Babylon. So.
Yes, it is actually much more likely that during the exile, when, like I said, when the Babylonians and much of the other civilizations had taken over Israel, that they copied from Israel's stories because they feared Yahweh. They feared the power that the Israelite God had. And so they wanted to steal that power if they could by transcribing the stories into their own mythos.
I'm not sure how much that one holds up, because I do think a lot of things like the Enuma Elish and I'm trying to think what it's Atrahasis, Gilgamesh. I think most of those do date to before the exile, because the exile was what, 700 BC? I'm blanking here.
Exile is not 700; it's 586.
Okay.
But still, you also have to remember that it's multiple times, especially the Northern Kingdom itself got ransacked way more and multiple times, and they had to rebuild. And it's also multiple times where the Israelites themselves gave up their stores, they gave up their everything way before the exile's time. And these cultures quite frequently, fought and they pillaged from each other. It's not unlikely that they would have each other's stories. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the Hebrews feared the sea so much, because of the stories of other cultures.
Yeah, that's interesting. So some of these dates for Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish, I'm pulling up my notes from other episodes here. The Enuma Elish dates back to 12th century BCE, approximately. Gilgamesh, I'm trying to see here. I'm pulling up a whole bunch of different notes. It goes back to around 2100 BCE, so that's one of our older documents that we have. So are you proposing that there was this cross stealing and cross raiding that was going on back to the 13th century BCE and all the way back to 2100 BCE, or would you refine it with those dates given?
I would say that a lot of these cultures are definitely back to you said it was Now I don't want to misquote you. What was the earliest date? You said 21 BC?
2100 BCE is the oldest approximate range for Gilgamesh. It could be a little bit younger, it could be a little bit older. But like specifically like borrowing from the Israelite traditions, do you think that timeline fits then? Because I'm not sure if I'm fully on board with that, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts because you have more notes than I do on Israel itself.
Right. And so this would go into a much further deep dive, but yes, I would in general believe it. Obviously, I espouse the theory. So yes, but the reason being is you have to remember with that story, you're coming, at least if I'm not mixing up my stories, Gilgamesh is the flood, right?
So,
or is that
there's a lot of different flood stories amongst Mesopotamian mythology. The Eridu Genesis is a partial flood account. I believe it's partial. I don't think we have everything, but we've been able to fill in a lot of the blanks. Atrahasis was one we just did. We just recorded that. That one is a Babylonian flood story. And then you have the Epic of Gilgamesh references a figure that survives a flood, but Gilgamesh seeks him out. He goes and finds this figure that has been granted immortality that would equate to Noah.
Right. And that was the oldest one you just referred to, correct?
Yeah, I believe so. I'm skimming through my notes here quickly, but yeah, that looked like that was the oldest in contrast.
So you have to think, after Noah, everyone came back from Noah. So all those nations that arose came from him and his family.
Right.
So everyone is aware of at least of Noah the being. Maybe not his name exactly, but they're aware of the man who survived the flood. And it's not difficult to see, especially if you look at a modern family, how quick the fighting turns. It becomes very crazy, and everyone has their own story. Imagine that for generations, for nations.
Yeah, I would get more on board with that theory that these are common threads and themes of a collective memory that existed before. Then I would probably be more I'd be more inclined to believe that than I would that the Babylonians or the Sumerians or the Akkadians are copying stuff from biblical texts and incorporating it into their narrative. Because having done this comparative analysis of side by side as we've been going through on the show, I think that it seems like they're both distinct enough from each other that there's not really. There's really vague similarities. People want to claim that there's all these similarities, like the Wesley Huff and Billy Carson debate. I'm not sure if you're up on that or not, but Billy Carson's been pushing the whole Bible copied older Sumerian texts. But there's just when he was asked to give examples, he could give like maybe one vague similarity. There's not that much that you see where these texts in my mind seem to be just really distinct from each other. But
right, so. What I'm saying is it is more likely that the elements that nations feared and nations wanted to kind of steal away from the power of, they often would take those similar stories, right? So a flood, right, it's a symbol of power, one that the Hebrews even feared, right? And a lot of them had feared it from stories of creatures from other nations that would trade along the seas and be like, well, the seas themselves seem to have their own power, right? Which is why they feared the sea, right? I'm not saying they inherently copied each other's text. I'm saying that they take elements from what they fear and saw as power symbols. And it's very common that most people would see lightning and give power or ascribe power to it if they didn't know what it was. Just like fire was mythologicalized for a long time because no one knew how fire came, and so they gave it a certain power. Or the sun or the seas, right? It's very common, and these are the most, as you would, trying to think of the right word, the easiest ways to see a supernatural power beyond human nature.
Right.
And so it's common for people to take those things.
And you see this as a common theme. One of the most prominent ones that stands out in my mind is how there's so many different storm gods across all cultures. Baal was the Canaanite god of storms, according to the Canaanites. And then you have Enlil, who is the storm god, according to Mesopotamians in general. And then you specifically have Marduk, who is the deity of the Babylonians, who was also a storm deity that kind of takes the place of Enlil in a sense. And then, I mean, you have Greek mythology with Zeus, you have Norse mythology with Thor. It seems like you really do start to have a common trend of correlating storms to a specific deity. So I would agree with you on that point there, that it is easy to deify certain more abstract things like that.
We're getting way off track.
Yes, we are, but that's all right. That's what we always do here on Musings and Mysteries, the Mythical Matrix. Got to take the tangents sometimes. So, but I'll let you bring us back.
Yes. Let me. You had me going off, looking at other notes. Now get back to the ones we were talking about.
We'll tell you what. We'll take a quick break here. Give you a minute to collect your thoughts, and then we'll come back and hopefully finish up this discussion if we don't get sucked down another rabbit wormhole. The final segment, sort of, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get our final words here from Reverend Harrison Smith. He's going to impart some final wisdom to us, and then he has indeed promised to come back a fourth time with us. So he must really just be a glutton for punishment having to deal with me on the show here. So, Reverend, I'll give it over to you, and then I'll kind of set us up for what you're going to talk about next time you're on, and then we'll wrap up the show.
All right, so we've been talking about the four source theory, the mixing of these sources with the variety of sources and perspectives is kind of hard to wrap your minds around sometimes, right? Especially in the initial chapters of Genesis, when you're talking about creation, the whole Tower of Babel, the flood narratives, the plagues of Exodus, right? You can see where oftentimes it seems like a story is repeated. Or it comes back and it says a slightly different way, right? More than 100 years ago, American scholar G.F. Moore called attention to the second century Christian scholar. Oh my God, I can't read right now. I'm going to have to read this out because my eyes are focusing pretty hard right now. Tatian, Tatian, who composed, oh my God, another word that I can't read, the Diatessaron. This is a work of harmony of the Gospels. Essentially, he got to the point where what would it look like if you just took all four Gospels and put them into one Gospel, right? And essentially, that's what you would see if you looked at the Pentateuch as one continuous book with four perspectives on the same thing, right? So imagine instead of reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you just read the Gospel with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all four of their stories just kind of laid on top of each other about the same thing. That's what they're kind of what happens here.
Okay.
Right.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, so it's just kind of a conglomeration of a bunch of different accounts.
Right. And just like with the Gospels, you have the argument of, well, one witness this, another witness says that, and if you do any sort of criminal backgrounds look and you see how many court cases are decided, most witnesses don't say the same thing, but they say enough of the same, and you can see where the evidence of what actually happens. And so you can see, just like with the Gospels, just like with eyewitness accountability, you can see where the story comes together and gives us a reliable and consistent Genesis.
No, that makes sense. That fits. Wow. Yeah, you've really added a whole new dimension to looking at Genesis here. I love it. This is some really good stuff. Do you have any other thoughts that you're wanting to impart to us before we close out here, or should I pose my question that you're going to come back and answer for us next time?
if I tried to add more thoughts, I'd just be making another episode. So we're gonna cut myself off here before we dive into too much more.
All right, fair enough. So my question then, which we'll address in the next episode we have you back for, which I don't know when that'll be. That might be a couple weeks. That might be another 6 months. But we'll see what happens. So my ultimate question is: we've kind of traced back to around the Babylonian period that we can count on these as being reliable sources from that period as not being tainted. But how can we trust it going further back to be something true, like the Christian belief system claims? So that'll be for next time. Well, Reverend, thank you for your time. We appreciate you hopping back on the show after all this time here to give us some added insights. I know we've been trying to work to get you for a while, but it really fit together well to have you jump on after the Mesopotamian mythology, because breaking all of that down ties in and sets like the precedent for these different regions having different traditions according to what's important to those cultures. And that really added a whole new dimension to the insights you were bringing to us to have that historical and cultural understanding for the Near Eastern region. So definitely providential that you returned when you did. But thanks for your time. We appreciate having you.
Of course. I appreciate y'all having me on, and I look forward to coming back.
Yeah, we will. See you next time. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers. That was Reverend Harrison Smith. You can find more information about our guest in the show notes. You can find the sources that he was referencing in the show notes as well. That being said, run through closeouts here. You can get a hold of us, m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at m.quad.musings. Check out the YouTube channel if you have not already, m.quad.musings on there as well. Musings on Mysteries and Mythical Matrix on Facebook. And trying to think if there's anything else I'm missing here. I don't think so. So whether you've been listening on the earth, above the earth, or below the earth, we thank you for quantumly transcending time with us today to tune in to this interview, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.